The battle for the Donbass region has begun. This morning, Russia's defence ministry claims to have struck over 1,200 targets in the country. The former boxing world champion, Vladimir Klitschko, whose brother Vitaly is the mayor of Kyiv, told GBNews the country will continue to fight Russia.
I am, as everyone in this country, stand together against Russian aggression. And we are ready for everything and anything to defend our country.
President Joe Biden's going to hold a phone call with other NATO leaders today to discuss the latest developments in Ukraine and how different nations can hold Moscow to account. Well, the spokesperson for the Pentagon, John Kirby, said the besieged city of Mariupol is still under Ukrainian control, despite relentless attacks from Russia. In the UK, Boris Johnson's going to face MPs today for the first time since he was fined by police for breaking coronavirus lockdown rules. The Prime Minister is expected to apologise again, but also to urge the Commons to focus on other issues. The opposition insists the Prime Minister misled Parliament when he said all rules had been followed in Downing Street. Train tickets for this spring are going on sale at a significant discount today. It's being called the Great British Rail Sale. The Transport Secretary says more than 1 million tickets will be up to 50% off this month and next. It's all part of a bid to help passengers with the rising costs of living. You're now up to date on GB News. I'll keep you up to date across the day. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. Now let's head over to Tom for this morning's briefing.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, today marks not only the end of Easter recess, but also the 1,000 days since the Prime Minister took office. Boris Johnson will this afternoon face MPs for the first time being fined by the Metropolitan Police over what they interpret as a breach of lockdown rules. Historian and crossbench peer Lord Peter Hennessy is amongst the fiercest critics of Johnson, coming out with the extraordinary quote that this is the most severe constitutional crisis involving a Prime Minister. Strong words, although I can't help but think that they're ones that are more than a little detached from reality. The Prime Minister is expected to apologise wholeheartedly yet again this afternoon, whilst also emphasising the need to move on and focus on other issues. But how will the House react to his statement? Well, I'm joined now by John Rentoul, the chief political commentator at The Independent. Welcome to the programme, John. It's a remarkable situation to see the Prime Minister stand yet again and apologise yet again. It feels a bit like Groundhog Day.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Tom. I mean, he's done it. He did it on Tuesday when he received his penalty notice and paid it. He did a short clip news for the TV, saying very carefully that he respected the police's decision. That didn't mean he accepted it. He respected it. He apologised, and we're told in the newspapers this morning he's going to deliver a full-throated apology in the House today. That means he's going to do his non-apology but louder.
It's interesting looking at the various newspaper reports of what's gone on. I'm interested there that you said he respected, and there's a distinction between respect and accept, although, of course, the Prime Minister paid the fine, suggesting that he does accept it, at least on one level. Is the calculation here simply that to challenge the fine would look so stubborn and be so politically risky that even though he still thinks he potentially did nothing wrong, it's better to just accept it and try and move on? Absolutely, and that's what the fixed penalty notice system is designed to do. It is paying the fine is not legally an admission of guilt. It just means you can't be bothered. You don't want to go through the business of going to court, and so it's to save the police and the courts and the miscreants time to just let them off without a stain on their record, because of course it isn't a criminal record. But no doubt the Prime Minister thinks he didn't break the rules. He didn't break the law, rather.
but that's not what the general public thinks.
No, and I suppose that when it comes to how MPs will be reacting to this and what happens to the future of the Prime Minister, the logic of this and the absolute situation of the rules and the interpretation thereof matters a lot less than what the public think. But isn't it the case that the public made their minds up about this several months ago?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you pointed out yesterday, Tom, it's one rule for Boris Johnson and a different rule for Nicola Sturgeon and Keir Starmer, who, Keir Starmer says he was just having a bottle of beer while he was in a work meeting. They had to stop to eat something. And Nicola Sturgeon said she was only not wearing a mask for a few seconds when she realised what she'd done, and then she put it on. As you say, there's a bit of a double standard there, I think.
Yes, it certainly does seem like that, particularly given that this particular fine that has taken place so far seems so particularly trivial. People that were in the cabinet room sang happy birthday relatively briefly. Now, there is a bigger question, however, about other alleged events that we're expecting may well elicit fines further down the line. Is it your understanding, or indeed interpretation, that the next fine that the Prime Minister gets issued with, because the bar for the first one was so low, it's almost certain there'll be another one, the next one he gets issued with, will he then return to Parliament and make another statement? And then if there's a further one, another statement and another one? I mean, this starts to get ridiculous.
Yes, it does. And he'll say the same thing every time, which is, I'm very sorry, without saying what he's sorry for. And that he feels people's pain, he respects the police's decision, and he was on the phone to President Zelensky only moments ago, and he will just do the same every time, apologise unspecifically, say how sorry he is, say how terrible people's suffering was, and there's a war on. And then try to move on. And I think the crucial thing is that once he's got away with the first penalty notice, he'll get away with the next one.
So potentially people who are running to the defence of the Prime Minister, speaking about the specifics of the first penalty notice being so very trivial. Potentially that's not exactly what Number 10 wants to hear, because they'd quite like the idea that all of these different fixed penalty notices get sort of obfuscated in the minds of the public and they all seem to be on a similar level. Then I suppose if people think of them like that, he gets away with one, he gets away with them all.
Yeah, no, but also, you're absolutely right, Tom. I mean, the public have made up their mind. I mean, there are a lot of people who feel very, very strongly about this, and many of them voted for Boris Johnson at the last election, and they say they'll never vote for him again. And you've got to believe them. But the opinion polls don't suggest that the Conservatives are in such dire trouble that it's likely to induce panic among Tory MPs, which is what's required to get rid of him. And as long as that situation continues, I think Boris Johnson is in a reasonably comfortable position, not least because the Conservative Party no longer has a readily available alternative Prime Minister who's the most popular politician in the country, because Rishi Sunak isn't anymore.
Yes, I think that's potentially the crucial thing, less so that there's a war on, even though that's what Number 10 likes to say, and more so that actually it would be a protracted and unpredictable contest if the Prime Minister were to be replaced. Well, I suppose we'll have to see what MPs say in the chamber later today. No doubt it will be exciting viewing, if a little Groundhog Day. But for now, John Rentoul, thanks so much for joining us here on The Briefing and discussing what's going on later in Parliament today. Well, now I want to take a moment to consider the mechanics of partygate. How the Prime Minister can legitimately make the case that he has not broken the ministerial code, that he's not knowingly lied to Parliament. Not because that's what Number 10 wants us to do. No, in the eyes of the government, they would much rather us be talking about literally anything else. They're keen to focus on Ukraine, of course, Russia's new enormous offensive in the east, the Prime Minister's important G7 phone call today with Biden, Macron, Scholz, Trudeau and other key leaders. The new weapons that the UK is providing President Zelensky with, the Prime Minister's almost daily phone calls with him, added, of course, to the cost of living crisis, the wave of inflation crashing down upon the entire Western world. Energy bills, a small boats crisis, the Rwanda refugee plan, and the Prime Minister's upcoming trip to India, the potential for new post-Brexit trade and security partnerships. And of course, while all of those issues are clearly important, today is a big day in Parliament not for those reasons, but because the Prime Minister will be addressing his COVID fine. And the opposition will be trying to deliver a contempt motion or even a formal parliamentary investigation. That is, of course, on top of the Met Police investigation and the Sue Gray investigation. Now, it seems to me that in the midst of all of this, we may be suffering from a bout of media groupthink. One that it may, in all honesty, be impossible to escape from. The more Number 10 tries to defend itself, the more people simply hear the word party, of course, and become outraged. People hear the word party and think of a raucous affair. They don't think of people who were all in a certain workplace anyway for legitimate reasons, who were seeing each other anyway. We've consistently heard heart-wrenching stories of people who couldn't see their loved ones, were unable to attend funerals, who missed out on human contact with people they were prevented from seeing. You can't help but feel moved by those stories. Yet, the Prime Minister is not accused of seeing anyone at all, that he would not have seen anyway for work purposes. He's not accused of seeing his father during lockdown, or indeed his very ill mother. He is not accused of seeing anyone who was not in Number 10, in effect, in his workplace and home, legitimately, for purposes explicitly allowed under the Key Worker Programme. So whilst those stories of heartache are, of course, moving and awful, they are also not comparable to what the Prime Minister is being accused of. We seem to have forgotten this in the fray. And of course, in order to have misled the House, as he is now being accused of, the Prime Minister would have to have knowingly lied to the House. He would have to have thought of his actions as rule-breaking. And I'm not sure anyone has presented any compelling evidence that points to that. I, for one, have seen a lot of evidence to the contrary, the briefing to press of events, the official photographs, and of course the teachers and nurses, indeed, and other politicians who were not issued with fixed penalty notices for similar actions. Indeed, the nurses who were celebrated for hosting a birthday party or a jolly dance together, as I spoke about and applauded yesterday on this channel. Now, in that context, out of the red mist of this scandal back in the real world, it's easy to see why those in Number 10 believed their conduct was not improper. And if that's the case, if the Met have acted as they seem to have done with a comically more draconian interpretation of the rules that applied to literally anyone else, and if the Prime Minister spoke in what he believed to be good faith when he said he believed he did not attend any parties, then he's not lied to the House. Perhaps we should all be a little bit more careful about asserting that he has, without having assessed that evidence that's in front of us. Well, now, the local elections take place in just over 2 weeks' time. The cost of living crisis, including spiralling energy costs and inflation rates, are thought to be at the top of the electorate's agenda. According to a new YouGov poll for The Times, 4 out of 5 people think Boris Johnson does not understand how soaring energy bills and inflation affect them. And beyond that, Ipsos UK ran a poll last week after partygate fines were handed out, asking if the Prime Minister is really still fit for office. Well, with Parliament back from recess today and public confidence split, how will this all play out in the real world? I'm delighted to be joined now by Kieran Pedley, expert in elections and political polling and the Director of Politics at Ipsos UK. Welcome to the programme. Of course, these local elections are 2 and a bit weeks away. Do people take into account national issues when they're voting in local elections? Is it a bit of a fantasy to pretend that local elections are all really, after all, about local issues?
Good morning, Tom. I think it's really a bit of both. So it's impossible to ignore the wider political environment when any election, whether that's a by-election or the local elections that are coming up. But of course, people do understand the difference. between a general election and a local election, which is why turnout is often so much weaker at the locals, which is something we always have to bear in mind when we talk about the results afterwards. And of course, local events, local issues do matter, whether that's sort of local traffic congestion or public services or council tax or whatever it might be, putting the bins out. So it also factors into the wider picture. But of course, what's going on nationally does cloud the general mood music of those elections and is therefore very important.
Yes, it seems to be that particularly when it comes to issues like council tax, the Conservatives have been able to steer away from bigger, broader political issues, particularly when these seats particularly were last voted on. I'm talking about Westminster, I'm talking about Wandsworth, these sort of councils that the Tories will be desperate to cling on to this time round. But it does seem to me that the Conservative Party is really up against it. It's almost the Labour Party's to lose when we're looking at what's going on the 5th of May.
Well, there's certainly going to be an expectation management game from both major parties, from all parties. You always see that with these local elections. People will want to suggest that whatever the results are afterwards, that they were better than they expected. The Conservatives do face many challenges, you're right. You showed our recent poll there with 54% of the public thinking Boris Johnson should resign over partygate fines. We know that people are following the cost of living crisis very closely. It's top of their list of concerns and something that is according to voters, that tell us the most important issue when considering how they judge the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So there are lots of challenges that the government face at the moment. So lots of negative headlines, and more recently we've seen that economic optimism is the weakest it's been since the 2008 financial crash. So it's a difficult political environment for the Tories. Obviously, Labour will have their own expectations to be seen, and that will be the argument afterwards, to what extent they've been able to do that.
And of course, the Prime Minister is not in an easy place right now at all. There was a focus group conducted in recent days that asked members of that focus group to associate the Prime Minister with certain words. And the biggest word that was being associated with the Prime Minister from people, including those who had voted Conservative in the past, was liar. Is it possible for the Prime Minister to recover from this issue where beforehand voters on the left always thought that Boris Johnson was a liar, but the issue that now various people who had voted Conservative last time see him as that?
So I think that the broader point is that Boris Johnson does face a real problem at the moment, which is he's fighting political fires on lots of different fronts. So on the one hand, his record on COVID, as in terms of the handling of the pandemic, divides opinion. He's seen as doing a reasonably good job on Ukraine. But on the cost of living, there's strong concerns about that and questions about whether the government's doing enough. And as I've said, we've got 54% saying he should resign over COVID-related fines. Can he recover? Well, it depends what you mean by recover. I think events always happen. I mean, you look back to Margaret Thatcher's days, her ratings were poor, and then the Falklands War happens and they recover sharply. But that's a very extreme example. Ultimately, what will matter at the next election, should it be Boris Johnson leading the Conservatives into that, is how people think of him relative to Labour leader Keir Starmer. Boris Johnson's net satisfaction rating with the public right now is around -27, I believe. At the last election, it was -20, and he won a stonking majority. The difference there, though, was that Jeremy Corbyn was on sort of -44, whereas Keir Starmer, I believe, was on -11, -12. I don't have the figures there in front of me. So the point is that Boris Johnson's had these issues before, but he's had different opponents. And it's that relative position of him and Keir Starmer at the next general election and who people think is best able to face the country's challenges and run the country that will ultimately decide what happens. So, could he win re-election? Of course he could. The Conservatives won a big election victory last time. It's a major swing against them needed next time for Labour to form any sort of administration. But right now, the mood music looks poor for him.
And of course, Keir Starmer has come under a lot of criticism for being pretty bland, for not putting forward many policies. But potentially that is a very smart strategy for him, especially if he's trying to keep those negative ratings low. If he's seen as relatively inoffensive, if inexciting, that might well be the way to sort of glide through and squeeze through the middle and take that election.
It's a delicate balancing act, I would say, because on the one hand, you do need to make sure that people turn out for you. And we know that certain groups of voters that Labour traditionally rely on, for example, younger voters, tend to turn out in fewer numbers than older voters. So he does have to inspire to some extent to make sure people do actually show up. And there is some evidence of Labour losing some votes to the Greens on certain issues too. So, I mean, you've got to be careful with that. But at the same time, it's a fair point. If we look across at America in the most recent presidential election, one of the interpretations of that result is it was a referendum on President Trump, and Joe Biden was seen as a sort of inoffensive alternative, someone that was well known, that people liked and didn't see as sort of too radical for them. And Joe Biden won that election. So you could argue maybe a similar thing will happen in the UK, where it becomes a referendum on Boris Johnson's leadership. People look at Labour, they might like them, they might not like them, but they don't see anything worrying or concerning in Keir Starmer, and therefore they go for him. That's one possibility. We'll have to wait and see what happens.
Situation, I suppose we'll have to see how it plays out. But for now, Kieran Pedley, thank you so much for talking us through exactly what's going on there. And of course, just 2.5 weeks until those local elections. Well, finally in the show today, new figures from the Home Office have revealed some interesting migration news. The number of migrants coming to live, work and study in the UK from non-EU countries has soared in the first year of our new post-Brexit points-based immigration system. According to the Home Office's figures, the number of work-related visas has increased by 25%. The introduction of the skilled worker route in January last year led to a third more skilled migrants entering the UK than the previous system. Well, I'm joined now by Jonathan Portas, the Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London. Welcome to the programme. Isn't this exactly what the Brexiteers promised? A sort of a clampdown on unskilled immigration and potentially more skilled immigration from the rest of the world?
Well, it depends which Brexiteer you asked. Your colleague Nigel Farage told me when I pointed this out about a few weeks ago on his show, he told me this isn't what the British people voted for. So I think the answer is that, look, there was no unified Brexiteer position on this, but in practice, where we have indeed ended up is that the new system is substantially more liberal for people coming from outside the EU than the previous system, and that has indeed resulted in a rise in numbers. Although, of course, partly this does reflect a bounce back after the pandemic and the fact that we're seeing some very significant labour shortages in some sectors at the moment.
Is this the system just being more dynamic and responsive to those particular labour shortages? So, for example, in a year where there aren't so many labour shortages, when we're not experiencing that sort of situation, would we be seeing less immigration from EU and non-EU countries then?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So, of course, and we saw that in spades during the pandemic when immigration basically vanished. But, of course, yes, if we have a severe recession and unemployment soars, then immigration will fall. Immigration is a sort of natural safety valve, particularly in a relatively flexible labour market, to deal with both recessions and booms. And at the moment, well, we're not exactly in a boom, but we are in a situation where there are an awful lot of vacancies, a lot of demand for labour, and unsurprisingly, that is leading to a rise in immigration, and the new system is indeed facilitating that.
And potentially this is fostering a greater sense of public spiritedness amongst the British people towards immigration. Looking at social attitudes with regards to warmth towards immigration, that seems to have risen since the referendum. Paradoxically, I suppose, when you look at some commentary around this issue, the people of the United Kingdom are becoming more positive about immigration, potentially because it now is perceived to be controlled, and that there is this system of control that responds to the labour market as it fluctuates. Might that be what's behind the shift in attitudes there?
I think that is definitely part of the story, that since the referendum, people feel that this system does give the UK government and the UK Parliament more control. I think there are other factors as well. For example, I think there's since the referendum, with rise in labour shortages in some sectors as some EU workers left, and then during the pandemic, there's a greater appreciation of the contribution that migrants make through to our workforce, to our economy, and to society. And there is this long-standing trend, in fact, of the UK public in general, and this goes for both Remainers and Leavers. It's sort of across the political spectrum, becoming more positive about the economic and social and cultural contributions of migrants. And I think you see this also in areas that are not related directly to the new system as well. So the Hong Kong migration scheme, for example, which is a very generous offer indeed, has not provoked the sort of backlash that previously was observed when, for example, Ted Heath allowed Ugandan Asian refugees to come here. There was a severe popular backlash. That hasn't occurred this time.
No, it's fascinating to see how those public attitudes have shifted, potentially not how many people expected they would after the Brexit vote. I'm afraid we've run to the end of the programme there, but Jonathan Portes, thank you so much for talking us through those really interesting numbers on migration. Well, that's it today. Coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick and Mercy, but first, here's the weather.
Looking ahead at today's weather, and the UK is looking showery for many with the risk of a little hail and thunder too. Let's take a look at the details. Plenty of showers in the southwest by the time we get to lunchtime, and some could be heavy. There will be sunny breaks though. In these, it should feel quite warm. A slightly cloudy picture around London, whilst other parts of the southeast should see some sunshine. A few showers are going to develop here. Cloud will build through the morning across Wales, with inland areas most likely seeing showers kicking off, whilst it should stay drier towards the coasts. It will be largely cloudy